She sewed it herself, cut every piece, chose every button, pulled every thread. Not because she needed a dress, because she needed to prove to herself that she could make something that belonged to her, something no man had chosen, no man had forced, no man could take away. And the color she chose? Blue, pale morning blue. The color of a sky she hadn't seen in 3 years, from a room with no windows, in a building where women were sent to disappear. This is the story of how she came back from that room, and the man who helped her remember what freedom looked like. What this story teaches us. Healing isn't one moment. It's a blue dress, sewn by lamplight, a fire built before dawn, and someone who stays on the floor until morning. This channel carries the soul of the Old West. Stories of love tested by hardship, of grief that reshapes people, of compassion passed quietly between strangers, and of women who refused to let the world have the final word. Subscribe if these stories belong in your life. Like, share, and drop a comment. I read every single one.
The road to Copper Creek was nothing more than a sun-baked scar in the dirt. Silas rode his horse, Drummer, feeling just as foul as the weather after a losing battle with the bank. Then his horse just stopped cold. The animal planted all 4 feet and refused to move 1 more inch. "What in tarnation now?" Silas muttered. Up ahead in the road there was a dark heap of fabric laying in the dust. It was too big to be a coyote and way too still to be anything living. But Drummer smelled something, and that horse never spooked at anything already dead. Silas dismounted and walked forward, the sun feeling like a brand on his neck. He got close enough to see it was a woman, face down in the dirt, arms stretched out like she had been crawling. She had on a heavy, long-sleeved wool dress, buttoned tight to her throat, and soaked clean through with sweat. "Ma'am?" He knelt by her side. No answer. He touched her shoulder and flinched back. Her skin was not just hot, it was on fire. He turned her over as gentle as he could. Her face was red and blistered, her lips cracked and white. A small, broken sound came from her throat. "No. Easy now," he said softly. "I am not going to hurt you." Her eyes shot open, wild and lost, staring at him with the fear of a trapped animal. Her hand, weak and trembling, went straight to the collar of her dress, pulling it tighter. "All right," Silas said. "I am going to pick you up. I have a horse and I have water. You're going to be all right." She felt as light as a child in his arms, a sick child dressed for a blizzard in the scorching heat. He managed to get her onto Drummer, and for once the horse did not put up a fight. He climbed on behind her, and the heat pouring off her body was intense, trapped by that thick wool. This dress was killing her. He reached for the top button at her throat. That is when she came alive, twisting in his arms with a strength that should not have been possible, clawing at his hand. A raw scream tore out of her. "Do not!" she yelled. "Please do not take it off!" Silas pulled his hand back like he had touched a hot stove. She collapsed against him, shaking so hard he could feel it right down to his teeth. "Okay," he said in a low voice. "Okay. It stays on, do you hear me? It stays on." She went completely limp, her head falling against his shoulder. Her breathing was fast and shallow. Staring at that heavy wool collar in the 100-degree heat, a cold feeling washed over him. A feeling he had not had in years, not since Emmeline. He urged Drummer toward home, carrying a woman he did not know, who was running from a fear he could not yet name. The ranch sat in a valley where Copper Creek was now just a trickle. He carried her inside and laid her on the bed in the back room, the one that used to be Emmeline's. He tried to bring the fever down, pressing cool, wet rags to her forehead and neck. That dress was a death sentence in this heat, but he had given his promise, and Silas Hull always kept his word. So he worked around it, soaking the outside of the wool with water and spooning sips between her cracked lips. Even in her fevered sleep, she fought him. Any time his hand came close to the collar or the buttons, her fingers would clench the fabric like she was holding on for dear life. "Who did this to you?" he asked the quiet room. For 3 days, she burned. For 3 days, she tossed and turned, repeating those same words in the dark over and over. Please do not take it off, until he could hear them even when she was silent. On the fourth morning, he walked in with some broth and found her sitting up. She was pressed into the corner of the bed, knees to her chest, with that dress pulled tight around her. Her eyes tracked him like he was a loaded gun. Silas stopped in the doorway and held up the bowl. Broth, he said. Beef and salt, nothing else. He set the bowl on the table and backed away until his shoulders hit the wall by the door. My name is Silas Hall, he said. You have been sick for 3 days. I have not touched that dress, and I'm not going to. Her eyes searched his face, looking for the lie. He let her look. I do not expect you to trust me, he said, but I do expect you to eat. A tiny crack appeared in her wall of fear. She reached for the bowl, her hands shaking, and drank it all down without ever taking her eyes off him. When she finished, she set the bowl down. Cora, she said. He nodded. All right, Cora. As he turned to leave, her small voice stopped him. Why did you not do it? He looked back. Stop what? The dress, she said, her voice barely a whisper. You could have taken it off. I could not have stopped you. A pained look crossed his face. I know, he said quietly. That is exactly why I did not. He closed the door and went out to the porch, where he slammed his fist into a post, not from anger at her, but at himself, and at the memory of another woman with that same haunted look in her eyes. Weeks passed. Cora moved through the house like smoke, quiet and watchful. The heat got worse. The creek ran lower. Silas lost his third cow that month and came in one evening covered in dust, dropping his head into his hands at the kitchen table. You lost another one, Cora's voice came from the doorway. He looked up. She was standing there, still wearing that same wool dress. Yeah, he said. Third one this month. Your water is too low, she stated. He almost laughed. I know my water is too low. No, she said, and her voice had a sharp new confidence. I mean, you are pulling from the wrong place. The creek is dying because the spring that feeds it has shifted. The water table moves. Silas stared at her. How do you know that? She looked away from him. I just know things. That is not an answer. It is the one you're getting, she replied. He studied her for a long moment, then stood up. All right, Cora, who knows things. Show me. She hesitated. The fight between hiding and helping plain on her face. Hiding lost. She led him out past the south fence to a low patch of ground where the grass was just a bit greener. She knelt and pressed her palm flat against the dirt. Dig here, she said, 5, maybe 6 feet. Maybe 6. You will hit it. A soul-crushing job ain't fair to anyone, least of all yourself. But what if you're the last one left in a town that's forgotten how to dream? This is the story of Silas, a man haunted by his past, who learned that true strength isn't about fighting louder, but about sitting quietly in the dark. It's about how staying put can save a life. And if you've ever felt like you failed someone, you need to hear this. He kept digging. It took him all day, clear until sundown. At about 5.5 feet deep, murky water started seeping in. By morning, it was a real well. Silas looked down into it, then over at Cora on the porch. He could have sworn he saw the ghost of a smile on her face. Well, I'll be, he said. Reckon so, she answered, but not today. Later that night, screaming tore him from his sleep. He grabbed a lamp and was at her door before he was even awake. The noise had stopped, but was replaced by a heartbreaking whisper. Please do not take it off. Please. He wanted to break down the door, but he'd seen what happens when a man barges into a woman's fear. It breaks something you cannot fix. So he just sat down, put his back to her door, and stayed right there. He listened to her cry until there was nothing left but silence. He stayed put, while his legs went to sleep and his back began to ache. When the first light of day came, her door creaked open. Cora was standing over him, her eyes red and swollen, one hand clutching the collar of her dress. "You stayed?" she whispered. "I stayed." "Why?" He got to his feet, his joints popping and groaning. He looked right at her and told her the truest thing he knew. "Because the last time someone I cared for needed me to stay, I left. I went looking for a fight instead. And she died, because I was too angry to be what she needed." The wall she kept around herself cracked a little wider. "Who?" she asked. "My sister, Emaine." He walked to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee. Cora followed and sat with him at the table. He told her the story in pieces, like pulling old, stubborn nails from wood. "She married a man named Virgil Cates, a respected merchant who sat in the front pew every Sunday. The whole town thought he hung the moon, but he did not. No, ma'am, he surely did not." He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. "Emmeline came to me twice. The first time she had a bad bruise on her arm. She told me she fell. I knew she was lying, but she begged me to let it go, so I did. The second time she had a split lip and a look in her eyes." He stopped and swallowed hard. "A look just like yours." Cora flinched, but she did not look away. "I lost my temper," Silas said. "I went straight to Virgil's store in the middle of the day. I beat him something fierce in front of half the town. I thought I was saving her." "You were not?" "I was making everything worse. The town turned on me. They called me a brute. The sheriff threw me in jail for 2 weeks, and while I was locked up, Virgil moved Emaine up north where I could not find her." The coffee in their cups grew cold. "She sent me one letter," Silas continued, "said she was fine, but I could tell from the shaky handwriting that she was lying. Her hand must have been hurt." Cora whispered, "Yes." "They found her in a river 3 months later," he said, staring at the table. "Called it an accident. Virgil played the grieving husband at the funeral. And I knew what he'd done, but I could not prove a thing. By the time I understood that I had to do it the right way, with the law and with patience, she was already gone." He finally looked up at Cora. "I learned something from all that. Being angry is not the same as being helpful, and being loud is not the same as being useful. Sometimes the hardest thing a man can do is just sit down and listen." The kitchen was still. Cora's hands lay flat on the table, her sleeves pulled down tight over her wrists. "The man I am running from," she said slowly, "he is like your Virgil, a merchant, a man people respect and believe, a man whose word is law." Silas felt a cold dread wash over him. She opened her eyes. "That is what makes it impossible." He held her gaze, not pushing for more. He just gave a slow nod. "Impossible is not the same as hopeless," he said softly. Cora just looked at him for a long time. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the table. She did not answer, but she did not run. And for now, that was enough. Cora still had bad nights, but something changed after that morning. She stopped shrinking away when Silas walked by. She still wore that heavy wool dress, a crazy thing to wear in the heat. But she wore it differently now, more like an old habit than a suit of armor. Silas noticed, but he did not say a word about it. Then, one Tuesday morning, when it was so hot the chickens were hiding, he spoke up. "I am heading into Ridgewater for supplies. You need anything?" Cora was at the window. She turned and said, "I need you to buy some cotton fabric, a light color, enough to make a dress." Silas blinked. "You want to make a new dress?" "I want to make something I can breathe in," she said, pulling at the wool collar. "This thing is cooking me alive. I have always known that." "Then why wear it?" "Because what is underneath is worse than being hot." Her voice was flat. "But I figure if I make something new with my own hands, I can take this one off without feeling naked in front of the whole world." She was staring out of the kitchen window, watching little dust whirlwinds dance across the dry yard. When she turned to him, her face was set. "I need you to go into town and buy some cotton fabric, something light-colored, enough to make a dress." Silas just looked at her. "A new dress?" "I need to make something a man can breathe in," she said, tugging at the heavy wool collar of the dress she wore. Sweat was slick on her neck. "This thing is cooking me alive, Silas." He knew it was, but he also knew why she wore it. Because what is underneath is a whole lot worse than being hot. Her voice was flat, with no room for argument. "But I got to thinking, if I make a new one with my own two hands, with long sleeves and a high neck, maybe I can finally take this one off. Maybe I will not feel like I'm standing bare in the middle of Main Street." Silas grabbed his hat from the peg. "What color?" She did not answer right away. "Blue," she finally whispered. "A light blue. Like the sky just before the sun comes up." He bought the blue cotton. He also picked up needles, thread, a couple of extra buttons, and a bit of white ribbon the lady at the store said would make for a nice trim. He did not know the first thing about sewing, but he reckoned if a woman was trying to stitch her own soul back together, she deserved the best materials to do it with. He set the package on the kitchen table without a word. When Cora opened it, her fingers traced the pattern on the soft cotton. A change came over her face, something he had not seen in all the weeks she had been there. The hard line of her jaw just seemed to melt away. She pressed the fabric to her cheek, closing her eyes for a long moment. "Thank you, Silas. It is just a piece of cloth." "No," she said, her voice soft. "No, it is not." She started cutting out the pattern that very evening while Silas sat nearby, cleaning a saddle harness. For the first time, the quiet between them felt easy, not like they were walking on eggshells. "You sure are handy with those scissors," he offered. "My mother was a seamstress." Her hands moved with a quick confidence. "She taught me how to sew before I even knew how to read. She said a woman with a needle and thread would never be truly helpless." Smart woman. "She was," Cora said, pausing her work. "She is gone now." "I am sorry to hear that. Do not be. Do not. She passed on before any of this mess started. She never had to know. And for that, I am thankful." Silas put down the leather he was working. "Can I ask you something?" "You can always ask. That man you are hiding from, the judge, does he have any idea where you are?" The sound of the scissors stopped. "No, not yet." The old anger started to rise in Silas's chest, but he pushed it back down. "All right," he said, his voice calm and steady. "When you are ready to tell me, I will be ready to listen. And if you are never ready, I will still be here." Cora picked her scissors back up, but her hands were steadier now. He thought he saw the smallest change around her mouth. It was not a smile, not yet, but it was the place where a smile might one day grow. The next morning, Silas was out digging post holes when he heard a horse coming down the road. He stood up straight and squinted against the sun's glare. It was a big man on a gray horse, riding slow from the direction of Ridgewater. He wore a dark coat, much too heavy for the weather. A rider appeared at the gate, and Silas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The man tipped his hat. "Morning. You Silas Holt?" "Depends who is asking. My name is Tom Dalton. I am a deputy from over in Helena." He shifted in his saddle, looking official. "I am searching for a woman who went missing about 6 weeks back. Her husband is mighty worried." Silas leaned on his post-hole digger, his face a perfect mask. "There are a lot of women in Montana, deputy. This one is specific, small, with brown hair, might be using another name. Her husband says she is not in her right mind, confused. He even said she could be a danger to herself or others." Silas let that hang in the air. "That is what her husband says?" "Yes, sir. He is a judge, as a matter of fact. Judge Edmund Ashworth from Silver Falls, a well-respected man who just wants his wife brought home." The blood in Silas's veins went from ice to fire. A judge, a man people respect. That is what she had told him. "I cannot say I have seen anyone like that," Silas said, his voice steady. "But I will surely keep an eye out." Dalton's gaze drifted past Silas toward the little house. Silas prayed to God that Cora was smart enough to stay hidden. "I appreciate that," the deputy said. "You should know if you do see her, the judge has a court order. She was in a facility for treatment and left without permission. Legally speaking, she is a fugitive." "A fugitive?" Silas repeated, tasting the ugly word. "I know how it sounds, Mr. Holt, but the law is the law, especially out here in the territories," Silas finished for him. Dalton gave a short nod, turned his horse, and rode off. Silas watched until he was just a speck on the horizon. He dropped the tool and strode back to the house. Cora was standing in the kitchen, gripping the countertop so hard her knuckles were white. She had heard it all. "A judge," Silas said, his voice low. "Yes, Judge Edmund Ashworth. And you were in a facility?" "I was locked away without a trial," she said, her chin lifting in defiance. "They told me I was hysterical. A danger. They said my own words were proof I was sick." Her voice trembled with old anger. "That is not being committed, Silas. That is being buried alive while the law holds the shovel." He pulled out a chair, his own hands shaking with a rage he could barely control. He pressed his palms flat on the table to still them. "Tell me," he said. "Tell me everything. Because that deputy is coming back, and I need to know exactly who we are up against." Cora sat down across from him. "My real name is Anna Marie Holloway," she began. "I married Edmund Ashworth 3 years ago. He was charming and educated. I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. For about 4 months. What happened then? I found his ledger. Edmund runs a place he calls the Ashworth Home for Wayward Women. Families pay him to take in wives and daughters who they find inconvenient, women who have their own opinions, or women who inherit property the men in their family want." Silas's jaw clenched. "What does he do to them in there?" Cora looked away, her eyes seeing something far off. "Some are given so much medicine they cannot think straight. Some are locked in closets for days. And some of us," she whispered, her hand instinctively going to her shoulder, "some of us get marked." "Marked how?" "Branded." The word was cold and dead in the quiet kitchen. "He burns a letter into our skin. H for hysteric. So if we ever get away, whoever finds us will know we belong to him." Silas stared at her, a hot blur filling his vision. He stood up so fast the chair screeched against the floorboards. He turned to the window, gripping the frame until his knuckles turned white, fighting a blind fury. "Silas." He did not turn. "Silas, look at me." When he finally did, her eyes were pleading. "I have seen that look on a man's face before," she said quietly. "Rage will not save me. I need you to be smart, not angry." The words were like a splash of cold water. He took a deep breath. "You are right," he said. "I am sorry. Do not be sorry. Be smart. That deputy said Ashworth has a commitment order. That piece of paper gives him all the power." "That is right. So we have to find a way to make the law work for you, not for him. But how do we do that when the man we are fighting is the law?" Silas rubbed his tired face. "There is a lawyer in Ridgewater named Howard McAllister. He is not fancy, mostly handles land disputes, but he is an honest man, and he plain hates judges. Why is that? A judge in Billings cost his family their ranch in a crooked land deal 20 years ago. McAllister has been fighting the system ever since. He is the kind of man who would listen to a story like yours and get mad enough to burn the whole courthouse down to see justice done. We have to do something. If he can't fix it, we find the next man who can. We have to start with one good person, Cora." She stayed silent for a long time. The heat danced off the dirt outside. Cora finally spoke. "There is something more. Tell me." "A fire broke out the day I escaped that place. I did not start it. A woman named Ruth Beckins did. She had been trapped there for 2 years. She was the one who told me where Edmund kept his ledger." "Did she make it out?" Cora's face went hard. "I do not know. All I remember is smoke and someone pushing me out a window. I can still hear Ruth yelling, 'Run and do not look back.'" Cora pressed her fingers to her head. The next thing I knew, I was on the road. And then you were there. Did you get the ledger? No, it was locked in Edmund's office. I only saw it when he left a drawer open, but I memorized every name I could. It is all right here. That is your gun, Silas said. That is what he is scared of. It is why he is not ever going to stop hunting you. Silas sat back. We better get a move on, then. The next morning, they rode into Ridgewater. Cora wore that old wool dress with a wide hat Silas gave her to block the sun. She looked just like any other rancher's wife in for supplies. No one gave her a second glance, except for one person. Margaret Tierney ran the general store. She was a solid woman with eyes that missed nothing and a tongue just as sharp. When Silas entered with Cora, Margaret looked right at the wool dress, then at Cora's face. Silas Holt, Margaret said, leaning over the counter. Since when do you have company? Since today, Margaret. This here is Cora. She is staying with me for a bit. Is that a fact? Margaret looked Cora up and down, not mean, but taking her measure. Honey, are you not about to melt in that thing? It is 102 degrees out here. Cora touched her collar. I am all right, ma'am. No, you are not. You are sweating through wool in July. But I reckon that is your business. Margaret faced Silas. Marlin's office is down the street. I figured that is where y'all are headed. How did you know? You have that look, she said. The one you get when you are fixing to do something noble and foolish. She pulled out a pitcher of lemonade and poured 2 glasses. Drink up. Y'all can be foolish later. Cora pressed the cold glass to her forehead, a moment of peace washing over her. Margaret, Silas said in a low voice. That deputy Dalton who came by yesterday. He was asking questions. Margaret's face hardened. He sure was. Asking about some lost woman. Said her husband was looking for her. She glanced at Cora. I told him I had not seen anybody like that. So did everyone else on this street. Why? Margaret slammed her glass down. Because I have been married 31 years, Silas Holt, and I know the difference between a worried husband and a man on a hunt. The way he talked about her like she was cattle that had wandered off, it made my skin crawl. Cora's eyes filled up with tears, and she quickly looked away. Now don't you start that in my store, honey, Margaret said, her voice turning soft. You save those tears. Silas gave Cora's shoulder a quick squeeze. He noticed that she did not pull away. They found Howard Emline's office above the feed store. The place was cramped with books and smelled of old pipe tobacco. Mlin was a thin man in his 60s with a white beard and the permanent look of a man who had been angry for a very long time. Silas, have a seat. Who is this? This is Cora. She needs a lawyer. I am not much of one. You are an honest one. That will do. Mlin studied Cora over his glasses. What sort of trouble you in, miss? Cora sat up straight, her hands clenched in her lap. The kind of trouble that has a judge's name on it. Mlin's eyebrows shot up. Tell me. She told him enough. About the marriage, the escape, and the deputy. Mlin listened, his face giving nothing away. When she finished, he took off his glasses and polished them. Judge Edmund Ashworth, he said, from Silver Falls. You know him? Silas asked. I know of him. He is a man with a long reach and powerful friends. He is the kind of man the governor has over for dinner. The kind of man no one would ever believe is a monster, Cora said flatly. The kind of man, Mlin said, who is mighty hard to fight in a court of law. Do you understand, miss? We are not just fighting a piece of paper. We are fighting his word. Around here, a judge's word carries a lot of weight. So it is no use, Cora said, her voice hollow. I did not say that. Mlin leaned in. I said it was difficult. There is a difference. You mentioned other women in that place. 43 that I knew of. And you think some are still alive? I believe so. Then we need them. One woman accusing a powerful judge is a story people forget. But 5 women, or 10, that is a storm that no man, not even a judge, can ride out. Silas saw a tiny spark light up in Cora's eyes. How do we find them? She asked. The names you remember, Mlin said. We start right there. We look for their families, their hometowns. Someone paid to put them in that place. There is always a paper trail. And the ledger? Silas asked. If it is still there, that is all of it. Names, dates, deaths. That is enough to see a man hang. But getting that ledger, Mlynn warned, means going into Ashworth's facility. And that is not a legal problem. That is a dangerous one. They sat in the stuffy little office, the heat pressing in. I am not asking you to get the ledger, Cora told Silas. I am just asking you to help me stand up and tell the truth, to have someone believe me. Silas looked at her, this woman who had survived so much and still had the grace to be kind. They will believe you, he said. I will make damn sure of it. Mlynn pulled out a clean sheet of paper. All right, miss, let us start with those names. They worked clear through to sunset. Cora pulled 12 names from her memory, 12 stories she had promised herself she would never forget. Mlynn wrote each one down, asking careful questions, building a case one piece at a time. The street was dark when they finally left. Silas helped Cora onto the horse, then climbed up behind her. He could feel how tired she was. You did a good thing today, he said. I just talked. Sometimes talking is the bravest thing a person can do. The stars were brilliant in the night sky. Silas. Yeah, that new dress. I think I will finish it tomorrow. That is good. And then her voice trembled a little. I think I am ready. I would like to take this old one off for good. He tightened his arm around her just a bit. Then I will build a fire. What for? He said. Because some things are not worth keeping, Cora. Some things need to burn. She did not say anything, but she laid her hand over his. They rode on through the warm Montana night. Two people carrying more than their share of pain, but moving forward all the same, because a storm was coming. Judge Edmund Ashworth was not a man who gave up. He was patient. He was thorough. And when his deputy returned empty-handed, the judge would come himself, and he would bring all his power and all his fury with him. They all knew it. The only question was if they would be ready when he got there. Cora finished her new dress just before the sun came up. Silas found her in the kitchen, the blue cotton spread over her lap. She pulled the last stitch through the fabric with her teeth, bit the thread, and held the new dress up in the soft glow of the lamp. It is finished, she said, her hands perfectly still. Silas set down the coffee pot he was holding. It is a good-looking dress. It is a plain dress, she corrected, but it is mine. She held it to her chest. I chose the fabric. I cut the pattern. I sewed every last stitch. It belongs to me. Yes, ma'am, he said gently. It surely does. She stood and looked him square in the eye. I need you to go outside for a minute, and I need you to build a fire. He just nodded. Outside, he built a small fire pit with rocks from the yard. The night air was still and warm. He struck a match and watched the kindling catch, the small flames growing steady and bright. He heard the screen door open and turned. Cora walked out into the firelight wearing her new blue dress. It fit her just right with the long sleeves and the high collar she wanted. But the soft cotton moved with her. It breathed. She did not look like a new person. She just looked like a woman who had finally made up her own mind. In her arms, she carried that old heavy wool dress folded neatly. She walked right up to the fire and stood there for a moment. Then she tossed it in. Her knuckles went white on the fabric of that old dress. You could see the war right there in her eyes. You are not required to do this today, Silas said, his voice gentle. Yes, I am, she replied firmly. I have been carrying his shame for 3 long years, Silas. And I am done. With that, she heaved the dress into the fire. It curled and sent up a thick smoke that stank of old fear. She just watched it burn down to ash without a single tear. I thought I would feel different, she finally said, her voice cracking. I just feel naked. Silas held his hat in both hands. That feeling will pass, Cora. I promise you. How do you know? Because I burned every last one of Emmeline's things. At first, it just brought back all the pain. Then one morning I woke up, and the weight was just gone. Ka stared at the dying fire. I want that morning. It is coming, he assured her. Soon, word arrived from Lynn. He had located 2 of the names on Cora's list, 2 women who had survived Ashworth's facility. While they waited, Cora worked herself to the bone, patching fences and hauling water, doing anything she could to keep her mind occupied. You are going to exhaust yourself, Silas warned her one afternoon as she stacked heavy hay bales. Good, then maybe I will sleep. You are not sleeping. She dropped a bale, sweat dripping down her face. I sleep just fine, Silas. He had heard her through the thin wall the night before. Her shoulders sagged. It is the same dream, every night. Edmund is standing over me with the branding iron. I can smell the hot metal. I try to scream, but not a sound comes out. Silas sat beside her on a bale of hay. That man did not take your voice, Cora. He only made you forget you had it. Her eyes were fierce with tears. What if my voice is not enough? What if they look at me the way they all looked at Emmeline? What if they call me a hysterical woman? The poisonous word hung in the air. Silas turned to face her directly. Listen to me. You memorized 43 names. You walked 100 miles in a wool dress in the middle of summer. You are the least hysterical person I have ever known, and I have known some very calm horses. A raw, startled laugh escaped her lips. Did you just compare me to a horse? I compared you favorably to a horse. There is a difference. She laughed again, a beautiful, ragged sound. Thank you, she said, wiping her eyes, for not treating me like I am made of glass. As he turned to leave the barn, she called after him. Silas, when he comes, do not let me break. You are not going to break, Cora, he said, and he meant every word of it. But Silas was scared. He was not afraid of Edmund Ashworth, but of how much he cared for the woman sitting on that hay bale. 4 days later, Margaret Tierney rode out to the ranch, and trouble rode with her. Get inside, she ordered before she was even off her horse. Both of you. In the kitchen, Margaret laid it out plain. Judge Ashworth is in Ridgewater. He arrived with a United States Marshal and a doctor. Cora's face lost all its color. A doctor? Dr. Parnell Webb. Ashworth calls him a specialist in female disorders, and he has papers, Silas. Official papers, a commitment order for one Anne-Marie Holloway Ashworth describing her as a danger to herself and others. Cora steadied herself against the table. He has a warrant and a medical professional to testify that you are insane. He has thought of everything. Where is he now? Silas asked. At the hotel. He's not here to talk, Silas. He's here to collect you. Cora walked to the window, her back to them. He brought Webb, she whispered, her voice barely there. She turned around, her face a calm mask, but her eyes were a storm. Dr. Webb was the one who held the brand. He is the one who burned me. The room fell silent. Then he just brought a witness against himself, Silas said, his voice dangerously low. No, Cora corrected him, shaking her head. He brought a weapon. Webb will say whatever Edmund tells him to. They will declare me unfit, and the marshal will legally take me back to that place to disappear. That is not going to happen, Silas stated. How will it not? He is the law. Then we will break the law. No, Cora's voice was sharp. That is what got Emmeline killed. That is anger, not justice. If we fight him with guns, we lose. I become the violent hysteric he claims I am. Margaret cleared her throat. The girl has a point, but she also has something Ashworth does not expect. What is that? Me, Margaret said, standing a little taller, and about a dozen other women in Ridgewater. She looked at Cora. Honey, this morning he came into my store and asked if I had seen a confused, dangerous woman. He smiled that smile I have seen from men who think a woman is just furniture. He called you his property. Cora closed her eyes. He always did. Well, Margaret continued, I smiled right back. Then I sent word to every woman on Main Street. There is not a woman in Ridgewater who is going to help Edmund Ashworth find his property. They had until the next afternoon, at best. Silas looked at Cora. She stood tall, afraid but ready. What do you need from me? He asked her. I need you to do something much harder than fighting. Name it. I have to face him myself, not from behind you, not in your shadow. I need to stand right in front of Edmund Ashworth and let him see clear as day that I am not afraid of him anymore. She took a breath. Even though I am. Well, that is the bravest thing I have heard you say. It is the most frightening thing I have ever said. There is a big difference. Mylan got there about sundown. He brought a satchel of papers, a bottle of whiskey, and some news. I heard from a witness, he said, laying documents out on the kitchen table. The lady's name is Helen Cartwright. She was in that facility of Ashworth's for 14 months, and she backs up everything. The drugs, the restraints, the brandings. She is willing to speak on it. Cora's hand flew to her mouth. Helen, she was in the room right next to mine. I heard her crying every night. She is alive, Cora. She got out, and now she is ready to fight. One witness, Silas said. That is just one. Malin, you told us we would need 5, maybe 10. I said that would lock it down tight. But one person to back up your story is enough to fight a commitment order. It is enough to get a proper hearing. And if we get that hearing, Ashworth has to show his records. The minute he opens those books, he is done for, Cora whispered. If those books show what you claim, he is finished. Yes. But the hearing will be before another judge, Silas pointed out. A judge Ashworth probably has in his pocket. Mellon gave a sharp little grin. Not if we ask for a federal hearing. Ashworth is just a territorial judge. His power stops at the state line. If we can prove his place violates federal law, and holding people against their will and assault sure do, we can ask for a federal review. That takes it right out of his buddy's hands. How long would a thing like that take? Cora asked. Weeks, maybe even months. I do not have months. He is here right now. I know. That is why we have to slow him down. We need to make such a racket in public that he cannot just snatch you up and disappear. We need the whole town to see what is happening. Margaret's voice came from the doorway. The women, they all turned to look at her. I told you about the women of Ridgewater. They are not lawyers or marshals. They are mothers and wives and sisters, and they know exactly what it looks like when a man comes to take a woman who does not want to go. What are you getting at? Lynn asked. I am saying that tomorrow morning, when Judge Ashworth strolls down Main Street to see the sheriff, he will find every woman in this town standing on that street. Not in his way, not threatening him. Just standing there, watching him, being seen. That will not stop him in the eyes of the law, Malin said. No, but it will make him slow his roll. A man like Edmund Ashworth prizes his reputation above all else. If the women of Ridgewater are watching, he has to put on a show. He has to be the charming, reasonable man. And every minute he wastes on that performance is another minute we can use to file for that federal hearing. Cora looked over at Margaret. You would do that for me? You hardly know me. Margaret came to the table and put her hands on Cora's shoulders. Honey, I do not need to know your whole life story to know what is right in front of my face. I see a woman who wore a heavy winter dress for 3 years in the dead of summer, just so no one could see what a man did to her. I know all I need to know. Cora's strength finally broke. It cracked slow like ice on a river, and then she just fell apart, pressing her face into Margaret's shoulder and crying. Not the quiet tears from her nightmares, but deep, heavy sobs that came from a place buried long ago. Margaret just held her, letting her shake it all out. Silas had to step outside. He stood on the porch, gripping the railing, and staring up at a sky full of stars that did not give a damn about any of this. His eyes were burning. He could hear Cora's cries through the wall, and each one felt like a punch to his gut. Malin came out to stand beside him. You love her, Malin said, stating a fact. Silas was quiet for a long moment. What I feel does not matter right now. It matters because it is going to make you do something stupid, and I need you to be smart. I am smart. You are the man who nearly beat a shopkeeper to death in the middle of the street over what he did to your sister. I know that story, Silas. The whole town does. That kind of anger does not just disappear, it just sits and waits. Silas turned to him. I know what I did wrong with Emmeline. I went in loud and all I got was blood on my hands and a sister in the ground. I am not fixin' to do that again. Even when he stands in front of you, even when he calls her his property and gives you that smile Margaret mentioned, even when he looks at you like you are less than dirt, Silas's jaw clenched up tight. Even then, good. Because tomorrow, we do not need a rough-and-tumble cowboy. We need a man who can stand perfectly still while the world burns down around him and trust the law to do its job. And if the law lets us down, Malin put a hand on Silas's shoulder, then God help every one of us. But we do it the right way first. We owe her that much. Inside, the crying had stopped. Silas could hear Margaret's low, steady voice and then Cora's, quiet and raw but steady all the same. He looked at Emmeline. First thing in the morning, you file that paper. Already wrote it. I will ride for Helena at first light. And Cora stays with Margaret in town, not out here. If Ashworth sends his man to the ranch, you can honestly say she is not here. It will buy us a little more time. She is not going to like that one bit. She does not have to like it. She just has to live through it. Silas nodded and went back inside. Cora was at the table, her eyes all puffy, her hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Margaret stood behind her like a guard. Cora, Silas said, tomorrow you're going to stay in town with Margaret. No, it is not safe for you here. Nowhere is safe. At least here I am not hiding behind somebody. You are not hiding. You are getting into position. There is a difference. Cora looked at him, her eyes red. You are starting to sound like a lawyer. Lord, I hope not. He sat down across from her. Now you listen to me. Malin is riding to Helena to file a federal case. That is our best shot, but it is going to take time. And the only way to get that time is to put you somewhere Ashworth cannot just make you disappear. Margaret's store is right in the middle of Main Street. Everyone can see it. If he tries to take you from there, the whole town will be watching. And if the whole town does not care, Margaret spoke up, oh, they will care. I will make good and sure of it. Cora looked from one to the other. She closed her eyes and finally gave a nod. All right, I will go to Margaret's. I will. She opened her eyes and stared right at Silas. But when he comes to that store, and you know he will, I am not running to the back. I will be standing at that counter looking him right in the eye. I would not expect anything less from you. Enz, I need you to know something. The night you sat on that floor outside my door, that was the first time in 3 years I felt like a real person. Not a patient, not a wife, just a person. You did that for me. No matter what happens, you gave me that gift. The room fell silent. Silas stared down at his boots, but Cora met his eyes, and he felt the world tilt. Every wall he'd built since his Emmeline passed just seemed to crumble. He spoke, his voice low and steady. Nothing is going to happen to you. Not while I'm still drawing breath. She almost smiled. In that tiny moment, you could see everything they couldn't say, and everything they already knew. Morning was coming, and with it, Edmund Ashworth. He'd marched down Main Street with a marshal and a doctor thinking he had all the power in the world. But Cora Holloway, the woman with 12 names burned into her memory, would be waiting. Not running, not hiding. Standing right there in her own dress. And sure enough, at 9:30 in the morning, here came Edmund Ashworth. He walked like a man who'd never heard the word no. On his left was Marshal Greer, on his right, Dr. Parnell Webb. But something was different. Every woman in Ridgewater was outside. They weren't blocking the street, just standing there. On porches, in doorways, leaning on posts with their arms crossed, silent, watching. Margaret Tierney stood in front of her store, and next to her, Ada Pike held a broom she wasn't using. Old Mrs. Harlan sat in a kitchen chair, knitting like the judge was just a fly to be ignored. Ashworth didn't miss a beat. He tipped his hat to Margaret. "Morning, ma'am." I'm looking for my wife. Small woman, brown hair. She's unwell, you see. Confused. So your deputy told us last week, Margaret said flatly. And still no one's seen a soul. That seems peculiar to me. What seems peculiar to me, Judge, is a man who travels 300 miles with a marshal and a doctor to fetch his wife. Most fellas just send a letter. Ashworth's smile got a little tighter. My wife is ill, Mrs. Tierney. She needs care. I can understand a great many things. The two of them stared each other down. Then Ashworth turned to the sheriff. Sheriff Boone, I have a warrant. I'd like to search the town. Boone shifted on his feet. Judge, I got no cause to believe that woman is here. Then a search ought to be quick. My warrant allows it. Your warrant is for Silver Falls. This here is Ridgewater. Ashworth's smile evaporated. Sheriff, are you trying to get in my way? I'm trying to do my job, which is keeping the peace. And right now, 3 strangers are disturbing that peace, demanding to search folks' homes for a woman nobody's laid eyes on. Boone stood a little taller then. He was scared. Cora could see it from inside the store. But he was standing his ground. I'll need to check that warrant with the territorial office. That could take a day or two. That's the law, Judge. Even out here. Ashworth stared hard at the sheriff. Then he turned his head, slow and deliberate, and looked right at the store window. Right at Cora. Their eyes locked. Cora felt her stomach drop. Everything inside her screamed to run, to hide, to just disappear. That old fear started to rise up in her chest like a flash flood. But she didn't move an inch. She stood right there in her blue dress and looked back at the man who had branded her like cattle. Her hands were shaking something fierce, so she pressed them flat on the counter, but she held his gaze. Ashworth gave a slow, knowing smile. He turned back to the sheriff. Take all the time you need, Sheriff Boone. I can wait. He walked back to the hotel, his men following behind him. Margaret came back inside. You all right? No, Cora whispered. But I'm still standing. He saw me, Margaret. He knows. Of course he knows, honey. This was never a search. It was a show. He wanted you to be scared. And from where I stood, it looked like he expected you to fall to pieces. And you stood tall instead. That shook him. The door opened and Silas came in, his face like stone. I saw the whole thing from across the street. Then you saw me trembling like a leaf in the wind. No, I saw you hold your ground. That's what I saw. Silas, he'll come for me tonight or tomorrow. He won't wait. Emmeline is already riding for Helena, Silas said. He'll file the petition. And that warrant of his won't be worth the paper it's printed on. Until then, you stay put, and you don't let that man see you flinch again. A couple of hours later, Dr. Parnell Webb walked into the store by himself. He was a thin man with watery eyes who moved like he was always approaching somebody who didn't want him there. He picked up a can of crackers and set it down. Afternoon, Margaret said. Can I help you? Just looking. His eyes slid over to Cora. My, he said. That is a lovely dress. Blue is your color, much better than the gray. Cora turned slowly to face him. His eyes met hers, and she saw it all. The amusement, the confidence, the certainty that he owned her fear. I don't believe we've met, Cora said, her voice steady as a rock. Oh, I think we have, he purred. Patients often forget. It's part of the condition, you understand. Margaret stepped up. I think you'd best leave my store. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. This is a medical order. It says the woman known as Anne-Marie Holloway Ashworth must submit to an examination. If she refuses, it just proves she's sick. Margaret didn't even look at the paper. Get out, I said, get out of my store. Webb looked at Cora one last time. The examination will happen, Anne-Marie, and we both know what I'll find. He leaned in close. We both remember, don't we? And just like that, something inside Cora snapped. Not with fear, but with fire. I remember everything, Doctor, she said, her voice quiet but hard as steel. I remember the restraints. I remember the smell of the brand in the fire. I remember you holding my shoulder down while it burned my skin. I remember the names of 12 women who died under your care. Webb's smile faltered. I remember your ledger, page 47. Patient Ruth Beckons. Treatment, prolonged submersion. Outcome, expired. Cora took a step toward him. You wrote expired like she was a carton of bad milk. The blood drained from Webb's face. So yes, doctor, I remember. The only question now is if you're ready for everyone else to remember it too. Webb snatched his paper off the counter and hurried out the door, walking so fast he was almost running back to the hotel. Margaret just breathed out. Lord have mercy. He is scared, Cora said. Her voice was steady, even though she was shaking. Edmund promised him this would be a quiet little trip. Just come in, pick up the patient, and go home with no questions asked. But it is not quiet anymore, is it? No, ma'am, it surely is not. Silas came in from the back. Cora, that thing you said about the ledger, page 47. I memorized every page I laid eyes on. How many pages did you see? 16. Edmund left the drawer unlocked one night. I had maybe 20 minutes, and I burned every single word into my mind. 16 pages of names and dates and what he did to them. That is 16 pages of solid proof. If Malin gets that hearing, and Helen Cartwright speaks up, and I can say exactly what I saw, a federal judge will have to look into it. The records will either prove I am right, or they will not. And if Edmund got rid of that ledger, well, that is a whole other crime right there. Silas just stared at her. You have been planning this. I have been planning this for 3 long years. Every night in that dress, every nightmare, I was not just remembering, Silas. I was building my case. That afternoon, the fight turned from whispers to paper. Marshal Greer showed up at Margaret's store around 4 o'clock, holding a second warrant from Ashworth himself. It ordered the immediate transfer of Anne-Marie Holloway Ashworth to Dr. Parnell Webb for a medical check. Greer was a tall fellow with a long face and weary eyes. He did not look like he enjoyed his job. He put the warrant on the counter. Ma'am, I have to serve you with this. I understand. You can come along quietly. If you do not, I am authorized to... To what? Silas stepped up. Drag her out of this store in front of the whole town? Mr. Holt, I am not looking for trouble. Then you ought not bring trouble in here. Sheriff Boone appeared in the doorway, all out of breath like he had been running. Greer, you hold on now. I just got a wire from Helena. Everybody froze. Boone held up a slip of paper. The federal court in Helena has received a petition about the commitment order for Anne-Marie Holloway Ashworth. Until they review it, all local enforcement actions are to be stopped. To the commitment or on hold. Greer's eyes widened. On hold? That makes your warrant completely useless until a federal court decides otherwise. Judge Ashworth won't stand for that. Judge Ashworth has no say in the matter. Federal power trumps territorial law. It is in the Constitution, Marshal. Cora collapsed into a chair, her legs giving out. She buried her face in her hands, taking deep, shaky breaths. A weight she had carried for 3 long years finally started to lift from her chest. Silas gently placed a hand on her shoulder, and she reached up to hold it. This is not over, she whispered. No, but the tables have turned. He is not the only one with official papers. Greer snatched the warrant and stormed out. They watched him cross the street to the hotel. A few minutes later, a crash echoed from the second floor. It was the sound of a man, unaccustomed to losing, finally breaking. Margaret poured 4 glasses of whiskey. I believe this calls for a drink. It calls for 10 drinks, Boone said, but 1 will do for now. Cora just held her glass, her mind racing. He's not going to leave, she said. This delay only buys us a little time. Edmund will not leave Ridgewater. He will wait for another opportunity. He will try to ruin my name before the hearing. He will call me a danger to others. He will spread lies and turn this town against me. Let him try, Margaret said. The women here have already made up their minds. Not every woman, and certainly not all the men, Cora argued. Edmund can be very persuasive. He will buy rounds at the saloon and shake hands after church. He will spin a sad tale about his poor, sick wife, and some folks will believe him. It is easier to believe a judge than a scarred woman. The room fell silent. They all knew it was true. Silas set down his glass. Then we do not sit back and wait. We take the fight to him. How? Malin asked. We need more people to speak out, Silas answered. Helen Cartwright is one. But the other names from that ledger, some of their families are right here in Montana. We should go find them. Cora's eyes lit up. I want to bring them all right here. I want every woman who survived that place, every family who lost someone, to be in Ridgewater for that hearing. I want a line of witnesses so long that Edmund Ashworth cannot ignore them. That could take a lot of time. Then I need to ride hard. Cora stood and walked over to Silas. She placed her hands on his chest, a surprisingly intimate gesture that made him freeze. Come back, she said softly. I always do. Your sister never had the chance to say that to you. So I am saying it. Come back to me, Silas. He covered her hands with his own. I will come back, Cora. That is a promise I will not break. She looked him in the eye for a moment longer, then stepped away and turned to Margaret. While he is away, we have our own work to do. What sort of work? The kind of work that gives a judge nightmares. I have memorized 16 pages of that ledger. I'm going to write it all down, and we are going to send copies to every newspaper within 200 miles. Margaret smiled. Now, that is a plan. That evening, Silas rode out with a list of names and a map Cora had drawn from memory. He had 6 towns to see, 6 families to find. He was building a wall of truth, one witness at a time. Cora watched him go from the porch until the dust settled and the sound of his horse faded away. She did not shed a tear. Instead, she went inside, sat at Margaret's table, and picked up her pen. Page 1. Patient Mary Ellen Cook, brought in September 14, 1862. Reason: hysteria. Method: forced drugging. Result: transferred. Page 2. Patient Louise Dennison, brought in January 3, 1863. Reason: moral insanity. Method: kept in isolation. Result: deceased. The names just kept coming. Far away, a man on a horse rode quickly as the light failed, carrying a list of the dead and the broken, racing against a powerful man who refused to lose. Silas returned on the 8th day. He came into Ridgewater covered in dust, with 4 women following close behind. Cora was at the counter when she heard the horses. She looked out and saw Silas, thinner but sitting tall. Behind him was a wagon, driven by a stout woman with gray hair. Beside it, 2 more women rode their own horses. In the wagon bed sat a small woman with sunken cheeks. Cora recognized her eyes first. She dropped her pen and ran out the door. Helen! Helen Cartwright slowly climbed down from the wagon. She looked smaller, older. Her hands shook, but her face lit up when she saw Cora. Anne-Marie. Helen's voice was raspy. You are alive. I am alive. I thought you died in the fire. I only made it out because of Ruth. She pushed me through the window. Tears welled in Helen's eyes. Ruth did not make it. I know. They hugged right there in the dusty street, 2 survivors of the same nightmare. Helen's soft crying brought Margaret and other women out of their homes to see what was happening. Silas dismounted, his eyes meeting Cora's over Helen's shoulder. He looked worn out but relieved. But there was something else in his gaze, something pressing. We have to talk, he said. Inside, there was barely room for everyone around the kitchen table. Silas made the introductions. Helen Cartwright from Butte, Agnes Dooley from Dry Fork, the woman who had lost her daughter at Ashworth's facility, Sarah Jane Mitchum, whose husband sent her away to get her inheritance, and Clara Noonan, who had escaped the place 2 years before Cora arrived. Every single one has a story, Silas said, and they are all ready to tell it. To who? Cora asked. The hearing date is not even set. It is now. Silas took a folded paper from his coat. Malin sent a message. A federal judge named Harlan Pierce will be in Ridgewater in 3 days. He is here to review your case and hear testimony. 3 days. Cora sank into a chair. Edmund will try to stop it. He's already trying, Silas said, looking at Margaret. What has been going on? Margaret crossed her arms. Plenty. The judge has been a busy man. He has bought drinks for most of the men in town and gave $50 to the church. He is telling everyone that his poor wife is being held against her will by a violent criminal. That would be you, Silas. Some folks are buying his story. Bill Turner thinks you are trouble, and the Reverend has had dinner with Ashworth twice. A few of the local ranchers are saying you are a disgrace to the town. But Margaret's jaw tightened. The women of this town are not so easily fooled. Cora looked at Helen, who stared down at a cup of water. Helen, can you face him? Can you tell a federal judge what he did? Helen was quiet for a long moment. When she finally looked up, her eyes were teary but firm. I have been silent for 6 years, Anne-Marie. 6 years I have woken up with his name on my lips. She pulled up her sleeve, showing a rough scar shaped like an H. I am finished being quiet. Clara Noonan, a young woman with red hair, spoke next, her voice trembling but steady. He told my family I tried to take my own life. That is why they sent me there. But I did not. I just told my father I would not marry the man he picked for me. That was my so-called hysteria. Agnes Dooley, the oldest and most furious of the group, slammed her hand on the table. My daughter was 19. Her husband said she was difficult. Ashworth took her, and I never saw her alive again. He claimed she died from a fever and then sent me a bill for her burial. A bill for putting my child in a hole like she was an animal. The only sound in the kitchen was Agnes's angry breathing. Cora reached out and took her hand. We will make them hear her name. You are darn right we will, she replied. The 3 days before the judge arrived felt like the longest in Cora's life. Edmund Ashworth was not idle. On the first day, Marshal Greer delivered a challenge to Judge Pierce's authority. Mlynn answered it within hours, citing federal laws and past court cases. Dr. Webb, smooth as a rattler, cornered Helen Cartwright right on the street. Margaret told Cora how he sidled up, saying he remembered her as a real cooperative patient. Then he got real close and hissed, Helen, you sure you want folks hearing about how you acted in there? I kept mighty detailed records. But Helen, bless her heart, did not flinch. She stared him down and said, I was restrained because I tried to stop you from hurting the woman next door. Her name was Ruth Beckons, and you are the reason she is gone. Then she turned her back and walked off. That snake was trying to pick them off one by one, but he was failing bad. He grabbed his rifle just as Sheriff Boone rode up, sweating heavy and looking pale as a ghost. Silas, we got trouble, he said. The kind that changes it all. Ashworth filed a criminal complaint on you this morning. Kidnapping, assault. He has even got Webb's words saying you are manipulating his wife's mind. Silas could not believe his ears. That is a joke. Wish it was, Boone said. Greer has a warrant. You ride into town, he will lock you up before the hearing even starts. Silas knew it was a setup. Ashworth just wanted him gone so Cora would be alone. She is not alone, Boone said, but she needs me. Silas gripped the porch rail, fighting back a rage so hot it made his teeth ache. There is another way into town, he said. I can take the back road past the mill, Silas told the sheriff. You gonna stop me? Boone just looked at him, then turned his horse. I reckon I came out here and found nobody home. Silas slipped into town, hid his horse, and found Melin waiting at the courthouse back door. Heard you are a wanted man, Melin said. We will sort that later. Get in there and keep your head down. The room was packed. All the women from Ridgewater sat on one side. On the other, Edmund Ashworth sat with his cronies, looking for all the world like a pained husband. At the front sat Judge Harlan Pierce, an old man about 70 with eyes that saw right through a lie. The judge looked like a man who knew the truth when he heard it. He called the hearing to order for Anne-Marie Holloway Ashworth. Cora stood up straight in her blue dress. I am here, Your Honor. When asked, she named Howard Mlynn as her lawyer. Mlynn stood up in his old suit that smelled like tobacco. He told the judge, plain and simple, Your Honor, my client was locked away for 11 months without a trial, a doctor, or her own say-so. She was drugged, tied down, and he took a breath. She was branded with a hot iron on her husband's order by Dr. Parnell Webb. A gasp went through the room. The judge raised a hand for quiet. "Those are heavy accusations, Mr. Malin, and we have witnesses to prove it all," Malin declared. Cora went first. She stood tall and told her story, clear as a bell. She spoke of everything, from the first time Edmund laid a hand on her to the night they dragged her to that place with no windows. When she told them about the branding, the smell and the sound of it, with Webb holding her down, 3 women cried out, and Agnes Dooley just sobbed. Through it all, Ashworth just sat there, cold as stone, like a man who never once figured a woman's word could touch his. After Cora, Helen told her tale of 14 months of drugs and restraints, and she showed the scar to prove it. Then came Clara, then Sarah Jane. One after another, the women stood up, and with every story, the room got stiller, and the truth got heavier. Model Bowser. The air in that room felt thick, like something was about to give way. Agnes spoke last. She had no scars to show, only a daughter's name. "My girl's name was Lily," she said, her voice unsteady. "Lily Ann Doley. She was 19 years old. She sure loved to sing. Couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, but she sang every morning just the same." Agnes grabbed the railing to steady herself. "Judge Ashworth told me she died of a fever. He charged me $12 for the burial. I paid it. I paid to bury my own child in a hole I'll never find." The room fell silent. Ashworth's lawyer, a slick man from out of town, stood up. "Your Honor, these are emotional stories, but there is not a shred of proof." "Oh, there is proof," Cora said, and every head turned her way. "There is a ledger. It is in a locked drawer in Judge Ashworth's office. I saw 16 pages. I memorized them. Names, dates, and 12 entries marked expired. 12 dead women." "That is hearsay," the lawyer snapped. "Then open the drawer," Cora challenged. "If I am lying, the ledger will not match. If I am telling the truth, it will." Judge Pierce looked straight at Ashworth. "Judge, does such a book exist?" For the first time, Ashworth's calm exterior cracked. It was a small thing, a tightening around his eyes, but everyone saw it. "The facility keeps standard medical records," he said, his voice stiff. "Then you will not object to a federal inspection." The pause lasted a second too long. "Of course not." "Then I am ordering one," Pierce said, putting his glasses back on. "In the meantime, the commitment order for Anne-Marie Holloway Ashworth is officially canceled. She is a free citizen. Any attempt to hold her will be treated as kidnapping under federal law." Cora's knees went weak, and Lynn caught her elbow. "Furthermore," Pierce continued, looking right at Ashworth, "the criminal complaint against Silas Hole is dismissed. It was filed under an order that no longer exists. It was filed by a judge whose authority is now under federal review." Ashworth shot to his feet, his chair scraping the floor. "Your Honor, this is an outrage." "Sit down, Judge Ashworth. You are not on the bench today. You are in my courtroom, and you will sit down when I am speaking." Ashworth sank into his chair, his face as white as a ghost. "This hearing is adjourned. Mrs. Ashworth, you are free to go." The room erupted. The women of Ridgewater swarmed forward. Margaret reached Cora first, hugging her so tight Cora gasped for air. Then came Helen, then Clara, and then Agnes, who held Cora's face in her hands. "You did it," she whispered. "You did it for my Lily." Cora could only nod, tears streaming down her face even as she smiled. Through the crowd she saw Silas. He stood by the back wall, hat in his hands, steady as a fence post. He did not need to push through the crowd. She walked to him. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would. You were wanted for kidnapping. Not anymore." A laugh, full and true, escaped her lips. She placed her hands on his chest, feeling his heart race. "Silas Hall," she said, "you are the most stubborn, infuriating, patient man I have ever met." "Yes, ma'am." "I am not finished," she continued softly. "You rode all the way across Montana to help a woman you found half dead in the dirt. Why?" He looked at her. "Because you deserved someone who stayed." She kissed him right there in the courthouse. Weeks later, the federal marshals returned from the Ashworth home with the ledger. Every single page matched Cora's testimony. They arrested Edmund Ashworth in his hotel room. Dr. Parnell Webb was arrested that same day. The facility was shut down, and 14 women were finally released. Agnes Dooley found her daughter's grave exactly where Cora said it would be. She brought Lily home and gave her a proper burial with a headstone and flowers. Cora's story was printed on the front page of the Bridgewater Gazette, and soon letters poured in from women all across the territory. One late August evening, Silas and Cora stood on the porch of the ranch house. "Malin says the trial will be in Helena," Cora said. "He wants me to testify again." "Will you?" "Every time they ask. For every woman in that ledger." Silas nodded and reached for her hand. "Cora," he said gently, "you never told me. The blue dress. Why blue?" She looked down at the simple cotton dress she had sewn so long ago. "When I was in that room, the one with no windows, I used to close my eyes and try to remember what the sky looked like, that soft pale blue in the morning before the sun gets too bright. I told myself if I ever got out, I would wear that color every day so I would never forget what freedom looked like." Silas squeezed her hand. "You are free now." "I know," she said, leaning into him. "But I am more than free, Silas. I am home." He put his arm around her. They stood together, two people who had both known failure and loss, and who had somehow found a way to set that burden down and carry it together. And in a small Montana town, a plain blue dress hung on a line in the summer wind. It was simple. It was hers. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.